Hello out there, Batty Lashes here. I've got my tomato juice and my paper and pencils, and I'm going to do a little painting video for you today. Please subscribe to my channel if you enjoy artsy content, and you can also follow me on Instagram for more daily content. So my plan for this painting is a Venus symbol, as you can see I'm sketching it here, that will be found in the middle of a cluster of amethyst crystals. I'm going to be using masking fluid on the symbol, and then I'm going to be watercoloring the amethysts around it. So in my initial sketch, I drew all the amethyst points with the same basic shape. They have this hexagonal tip, it has the six sides and a point. But I found that that didn't really reflect the sort of natural divine femininity that this piece was supposed to be inspired by. So I decided in the end to not use this design and just start over my sketch. A natural amethyst cluster wouldn't look like this unless you're playing Minecraft, which we're not. These are supposed to be real amethysts, and they look more like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. They have sort of uneven facets and different shapes all over them, and not this sort of regular machine-made kind of look to them. So I started over, drew the symbol again. This is art. And then I drew a lot more naturalistic, uneven shapes on my amethysts, and I like the look of it a lot more. It was a lot more true to my original vision, so I went with that instead. So once I was happy with my sketch, I threw it on my light table and transferred it to a thick watercolor paper. I used a fairly hard pencil and pretty light lines because I don't want them to show through the watercolors when I'm done. The next step in the process is applying my masking fluid, which I'm holding upside down. There we go. So I'm painting on the masking fluid onto the facets of the crystals that would receive the most light, so that they appear really white and super highlighted. And I'm also painting masking fluid onto the Venus symbol so that it stays the color of the paper and just sort of looks all magical in the middle of all these crystals. And then in order to get really fine white lines in the corners and on the edges of the crystals, I used a nib pen, or a dipping nib, and I dipped that in the masking fluid, and that worked really well to get these super fine lines. So pro tip, if you need super thin lines and don't want to ruin your bestest, tiniest brush, which you will if you use it with masking fluid, use a nib. It works really well. It's also much easier to clean than a brush, and you won't end up ruining your nice tools. Once the masking fluid had dried, I could prime my paper, and I just wet it with water, soaked it thoroughly, and let that dry while I took a break for lunch. So now I'm back, I'm ready to paint with my sweets and my motivational caffeine. Love my coffee. I decided to use my artful watercolors. I forgot to clean it, so hang on. Okay, nice and clean. Ready to paint now. So I'm going to be using mostly purple, of course, because they're amethysts and they're purple, but also a bit of magenta or pink, because looking at my reference picture I can see that there are tiny little inclusions that are a little bit more sort of red toned or pinkish. I started by moistening the paper once again, sorry for using that word, because in my reference pictures the crystals were all a lighter shade towards the bottom. So I wanted to have the paper wet so that it would be easier to blend that out. And I started with a really light shade of purple as the base, which I could then build up into darker and darker shades. Now the paper is really wet, so to save some time I busted out my handy blow dryer. Well, my retired hairdryer that now has a job in my art room, apparently. So I just blow dried that a little bit. Didn't have to be completely dry for me to continue, but I just didn't want it to be quite as wet because I didn't want a ton of bleeding in the next step. So now it's time to darken and add details to the sides of the crystals, and I started working wet on wet, sort of facet by facet, so that I didn't have a ton of bleeding over the edges and that I could keep the areas separate. I had a couple of reference pictures up on my phone of real crystals that I kept checking back to just to get some ideas of color placement and, where the crystal would be at its darkest, which was a lot of times around the lightest parts, or the bits that have the most light on them. So then I just repeated this process until all the facets of all the crystals had some detail and some shading. Now, I will say, I really did like the look of these crystals when they were all pastel purple and stuff. Lilac is my favorite color after all, but due to the nature of the picture with the white symbol in the middle and the white background, I felt like I really needed a lot more contrast to make those elements pop. And I mean, the Venus symbol in the middle is the whole point of the piece, so as always, when you're painting and making decisions, you have to remember, what is the point of the piece? So even though I said I really liked this when it was pastel, I found that adding a lot of darkness just really made the piece come together and just gave it that little extra bit of oomph that it needed. And also, just looking at my reference pictures, I found that there were some parts of the crystals that were so dark purple that they were nearly black. Now, I didn't want to incorporate a ton of black into this piece. I kind of wanted it to be a little bit monochrome, but at least I felt it was okay to go in with this almost pure dark purple, which is really, really dark in this palette, by the way. And it worked really well. I think it gave the piece the contrast that it really needed. And it was sort of at this point I realized that I probably would have done well to mask around the crystals as well, because I'm an adult who cannot paint within the lines, apparently. Now, I knew I was going to be editing this in Photoshop later, so that's fine, but it would have been nice to have an original that, you know, looked okay. I couldn't do anything about that part that leaked out, and I'm just gonna have to live with that. So I guess it's okay, but thank goodness for Photoshop. Now it was time to add some shadows, and I did this by adding some Payne's Gray to the dark purple shade that I was using, and then just sort of applying sort of drop shadows around the cluster. I'm not sure these are completely logical. What are light sources? I have no idea, but they gave the piece a bit of extra dimension and made it look a little bit less flat, so that's good, even though I'm not sure they're physically logical. Then I used that same shade to apply some outlines around the piece, to create a border to the white paper, and anywhere where I thought that the picture needed a little bit more definition and darkness. I also did this around some of the masked bits, and that serves to make the parts that are still paper white look even brighter. And now that everything is dry, it is finally peeling time. So I just rolled up the edge of the masking fluid and pulled, and oh, look at that peel. Look at it go. Yes, this is so satisfying. Oof. Oh, there we go. I gotta rewind that. I gotta watch that last bit again. Look. Yeah, look at it go. So peely. Yes, look at. Anyway, I rolled off the rest of the peely bits, and look how nice that looks. The white looks really good against all that purple. And I used my fine electric eraser just to get rid of any sort of pencil lines that were still visible. just to clean it up. And then I put it in Photoshop, which for some reason I forgot to film. But I cleaned up the edges, took away any textured bits that didn't look right, you know, and all that. But not a whole lot of editing done, just really that one big blob on the left side. But yeah, here she is, all done, my piece. I call her Manifestation. You read what you will into that. So yeah, thanks for watching. I hope I could inspire you, and I will see you next time. Bye!